Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Getting back to work on the Cobra in this video, and you guessed it, it's going to be back on the transmission. Last few episodes have been about the teardown, and then I went through the preparation, all the parts that are going in, and last video I put together the output shaft slash main shaft assembly. So now it is going to be time to actually get this box together. So this video is going to be getting the cluster gear in, all the bearings, getting the main shaft slash output shaft in, and getting everything set up, all those fun things. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get the camera turned around and get to work on this box. All right, so first thing up is we need to get the counter gear ready to install in the box. And what I need to do with that involves the bearing. Basically, the first thing that you want to do is get the bearing cap for the counter gear, since this acts as a plug, installed in the housing. And with that, I'm also going to go ahead and put the matching bearing on the counter gear, because I don't want to mix this up with any other bearings or whatnot, since they are a match set, the race slash plug and the bearing itself. So I'm going to go over to the vise or the press this on to the end of the counter shaft, and that's going to be the big gear end here. So you get that installed on the big gear end, and then once that's installed, I'll come back and we can get the plug slash race installed into the actual transmission main housing. So I'm going to go ahead over to the press and get this done. All right, here you can see the bearing is pressed down. I did put some of that assembly grease on it just to make sure it slid on no problem. And one thing I will say is you do want to make sure it's seated properly. I actually have an assortment of old bearing hubs laying around from previous transmissions and whatnot. So I use that. I put this on this direction, pushing down against that plate, and then once it was seated there, then I used that old bearing center and put it over top just to make sure it was completely seated, because it's hard to tell, but the actual shaft does sit ever so slightly higher than the actual bearing when it's fully seated. So just a heads up on that. And real quick, back at the bench, I put it inside of its race and just making sure there's no noises, nothing weird, and it feels perfect. So nice and smooth. So next we'll be installing the race in the transmission housing. All right, got the housing on the bench, and this is the front side of it. So this is where the race is going to go, and it comes from the inside and acts as a plug. It's going to need to be sealed in place. It does have a little O-ring on it, but you still want to put some sealant on the edge of it. So first thing I did, which I've already done, is take some brake cleaner on a rag and just wipe it around that inner, just to clean out any old debris or dirt or whatnot. So I'm going to let that dry real quick, and while I'm doing that, I'm going to go grab the sealant and come back here in a minute. All right, so what I'm going to be using is Permatex anaerobic gasket maker. So I've got the tube of that. You also, it recommends, and I highly recommend using it, is the surface prep. So what I'm doing, since I'm using this no gasket, you need to put this on one side of it, let it dry for a minute or two, then put the gasket maker on the other part. Once you've waited that minute or two, then go ahead, put this in place and let it cure. So like I said, I wiped this out with some brake clean. I also wiped out the outer edge mating surface of the bearing race with brake clean. These also should have a small O-ring on it. This race in the rebuild kit already came with a O-ring on the bearing, and then the kit, I believe, also came with a second O-ring. I think I remember seeing a small one in there. So it looks like it came with a backup in case you tear this, because it is very easy to tear them installing them. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is spray this with the surface prep, let it cure a minute or two, and then I'm going to put the gasket maker on the bearing race and install the bearing race. Now, the way I am going to install the bearing race, there's a couple ways you can go about it. You can either press it in, but you're going to need to have like a long bearing press tool and press it in through the inside, or you can hammer it into place, lightly tap it in from the inside, which that is how I'm going to go about doing that. And that is the reason that I have not put the slider, pivot, or the reverse gear or anything into place, because I want to be able to have as much range of motion of a hammer as possible to hammer that into place. Again, you're not going to be hammering it hard. You're just going to lightly tap it in, And also, be cognizant, make sure that it's not getting cocked or anything like that, because if it does, it'll stop moving, and you need to use a punch on the other side and just pop it back a little bit to get it level again, and then keep hammering down. So I'm gonna go ahead, do everything I just said, and get that thing installed. And just real quick, you can see I have it set in place. And I did put the anaerobic seal over the O-ring just to kind of act as a lubricant for the O-ring as well. So now I'm going to use a small metal hammer and just lightly tap it in, using the flat edge there, and just work it down into place. And there it is, hammered into place. So I'm going to go ahead and just clean up all the excess runoff, or that's squeezed out. You'll know when it's home, the pitch will change as you're hammering on it. It'll get all of a sudden very, very solid. So once you start hearing that all the way around, you know that it is in place and you're good to go. So I'm gonna go ahead and wipe this up, and I'll be right back. All right, so next on the list is gonna be putting in the reverse idler gear, as well as the shift lever for reverse and fifth, and the associated mechanisms. I did order a new gear, and then the kit came with a new O-ring to replace the one that came out. So these parts are not going to be reused. I will be reusing the roll pin. The rebuild kit comes with one replacement roll pin. The one that was in here is fine, so I can go ahead and reuse it. So I'm going to go ahead and wipe off the idler gear, get it ready to be installed, wipe everything else off, make sure it's oiled up and ready to go, and then I can come back and walk through the installation. All right, so here we are. I've installed the reverse gear slider. I wiped out the case again real quick first, because just from the hammering that bearing race in, there may have been a little bit of debris and stuff that got dislodged, so I did that, and I also did wipe out the inside of that bearing race just so I didn't forget to. But anyway, as far as getting the idler gear on, I did put some of that assembly goo inside of here after cleaning this off with some brake cleaner and a rag. And then basically you just start the pin on this side, the big blunt flat edge goes out, slide it in, put the gear on, and then the new O-ring goes on, and then the narrow end will go through the hole here. Once it's in, you just make sure that the hole, or the hole for the roll pin, is up and down, and then use a 3/16 punch to drive the roll pin back in so it's coming out both sides. So that is secure. Next on the list is going to be the long push rod for the mechanism, as well as the fork and spring for that reverse idler. So I'm gonna go grab those, get those installed. All right, and here you can see the mechanism is all reinstalled. So basically here's how I went about installing it. First thing I grabbed was the fork, and I did put some blue assembly goo on the basically what would equate to the fork pads. There's no separate pads, it's just built into the casting there, as well as where the shaft would be, and then there's a roller ball that sits in this groove. I put some on that as well. So you lay the fork in place on here where it fits into the reverse gear, and then just let it lean in, and if you wiggle this a little bit, it'll fall right into the groove on this lever. That's pretty straightforward. Let that sit there, and then you can go ahead and walk this rod through. The end with the hole goes out, because this is what's going to be the fifth gear slider is going to be attached there, and then just walk it through. I did put some blue goop on the end of this rod, as well as on this ball as well, the roller that goes into this arm. And then as you're walking it through, you want to have your spring in place. Slide it through the fork here, slide it through the spring. The long arm goes onto the reverse fork. The short length is what connects onto the case down here. And then just walk it in there. And then when you're pretty close to being in there all the way and you need to get it in this groove, you just twist, because you're going to have the roller ball up so it's not hanging on anything. Twist, and again, just wiggle on this a little bit. It will fall into place inside of that groove that it goes in, and you are good to go, other than just grabbing some needle nose pliers and hooking the spring. I did this end first, got that on its little tab, and then grabbed this end and hooked it over the tab on the fork for reverse idler. And now we are good to go. Everything is in place where it's supposed to be. So next up is going to be installing the actual cluster gear now that this is all in place and everything's been wiped out, cleaned out, including wiping out the race again, making sure there's nothing in there. So what I'm going to do is, since I've already got the bearing on the cluster gear, reinstalling that, you put the rearward facing end, which is this long end, in through the hole first, walk it in, and then you can drop the, well, actually in this hole, sorry, pointed the wrong one. Walk it in, and then you can set it in place, putting the bearing in there. I'm not gonna put any grease or anything on the bearing at this time because I will still need to press on the other bearing, and then I'm gonna need to set the preload shim-wise, and I don't want anything throwing off the resistance, such as like some thick assembly grease would. So for now, I'm gonna put it in dry. I will put some grease on everything when I do the final assembly. So that being said, I'm gonna go grab the counter shaft and get that installed. All right, as you can see, it's in place, and I've got, you know, the bearing sitting in the race. You may need to pull forward a little bit on the reverse pilot or idler just to, you know, clear second gear right here. So just a heads up on that. But now it's sitting there, sticking out the bottom hole. So the next thing is going to be pressing on the bearing for this end of the counter shaft. There's two ways you can go about doing it. You can actually use a press, but you are going to need some sort of tool that'll fit down the length of this shaft in order to, you know, press it on. Or you can use a punch and a hammer and slowly walk it on. Here's the bearing itself. I'm gonna keep the race off to the side for now. But yeah, you'll probably want to put a little grease inside of here just so, you know, it goes on pretty smoothly, and then you can go ahead and knock it in place. I'll go ahead and try punching it on real quick, see how that works. I do have a bunch of old bearing inners that I could stack and use in theory with the press, but if I can get it to punch on pretty quick, then I'll go ahead and do that. So I'm gonna get this seated where this is on the table and this is facing upright, and see if I can use a punch and get this in place. All right, here you can see the bearing is pressed down. It's hard to tell, but it is definitely flush. I ended up using the press. I tried using the hammer and, you know, a little punch that I have, and it just keeps wanting to pop up the side opposite of what you're hammering, and I got sick of fighting with it. I have a press, why not use the tool that I have? So I had a bunch of different old races, and I was able to stack them up high enough and put a piece of flat bar stock across the top, and that was enough to go ahead and press it down and get it put into place. It doesn't take too much force, so once it starts going down, you know you are all set. So like I said, I'm not putting any grease or anything on it. You know, definitely check, make sure everything spins freely. And as you are pressing it on, check and make sure that this race isn't binding up and that like whatever you're using to press hasn't pushed up against it, and you're not going to bend the cage or anything. So I'm go ahead and put the race for this bearing in place. And then next up is going to be going ahead and getting the new support that I have for it and the original shims, and then we need to get this thing shimmed right and set how it is supposed to be based on the amount of drag. So I'm gonna go ahead and get parts, and then I'll be right back. All right, so I did get that race put all the way into place, and, you know, definitely give her a little spin, make sure everything's free and you're not hearing any bad noises coming from the bearings. Again, there's no grease or anything in either the top or the bottom bearing, but you still want to make sure that they're free. Nothing's going to be an issue. You know, I will grease them before final assembly, but still need to work some stuff out first. So that being said, I grabbed the new bearing retainer. This is the AMP billet aluminum one. The whole point of these is, you know, if you look, it's a lot thicker than that stock stamped piece over there. And what happens with these boxes is, being that you have helical cut gears, that puts loads to the back and to the front, just based on the like angle. It's going to go outward when the gears mesh, so that puts load on the front of the box and the rear of the box. And what happens is, under a lot of heavy load, that retainer, which is thin steel, will actually blow out and it'll actually deform. So the bearing will push outward, and that will give you slop. And the more slop you have, the more screwed up your meshes with your gears, and that's when you end up chewing teeth off. So the point of this is to help, one, support the whole back of the box, as well as keep the bearing tight in place where it's supposed to be and not blow out and deform like the stock stamped steel piece will. So what we have to do with this part here is, I did grab my original shim. So this is the shim that went inside of that old one and pushed up against the race. I'm going to need to install this. I'm going to start with my original shim. I have a feeling I'm going to need to either add or subtract. We will see. But being that that's not a stock part, I'm guessing it's not going to be perfect. I'll probably just, you know, run 2 screws down all the way, see where things end up, and go from there. Now, what you're looking for on the counter shaft is based on the fact that these bearings are going to break in, they're new bearings. You either want to set it up for a certain amount of end play, which is going to be 0, or you want to set it up with some drag, just a feel for drag on the actual when you spin the counter shaft, and you're looking like 4 inch-pounds to 6 inch-pounds of drag. And if you have that, then you know you're pretty good as far as the tension on this counter shaft, and you can go ahead and knock it down. So what I'm going to do to start, like I said, is open this up, install it, and see where I'm at as far as my shaft goes. If I can, spin it at all, if there is drag, or if it's free and I have end play, then I will need to adjust the shims accordingly. Well, I think I got really lucky. I installed my original shim, and that was it. I was able to get this tightened down nice and flush, and well, I'll show you in a second. I don't want to screw up the dial that I have on there, but you can see I've got the dial zeroed out because I don't have a very small inch-pound torque dial wrench or anything like that. But you can see I'm pushing up on it, and there is no movement whatsoever. So we're good there. We have no end play. And then if I remove the dial from there, you can see it does still spin, and it does have some resistance, but it's nothing that's binding. It'll spin freely, no problem. So I got no end play. I got a slight bit of preload. I think I'm pretty happy with where that is set up. So what I can do now is go ahead, remove this plate, put some grease on the bearings, because like I said, they are dry other than what oil they had on them when they came from the factory. And then I can go ahead and torque these 4 bolts down. They get torqued to 15 foot-pounds using red Loctite, because with this plate you no longer have the little tabs that you bend over. So red Loctite, 15 foot-pounds, and those, just for reference, if you have this kit, are a 5mm Allen key head. So that is what you need for these 4 screws. So 5mm, 15 foot-pounds, red Loctite. All right, and here it is, all reassembled, torqued to 15 foot-pounds with red Loctite, and you can see I did put grease on the race. And as expected, it is definitely draggier with that grease because it is a thick assembly grease. But I mean, it moves fine. It's just, it definitely has more resistance. So that's why I wanted to test it out first without putting grease on it, because that does make a difference. So that being said, I'm going to get this thing uprighted again so we can move on to the next step. All right, it's back level, and next thing that is going to be going in is going to be the main shaft / output shaft. So what we're going to do is, get it flipped around basically, and the tail shaft comes in an angle through the hole. You'll have to walk the main body of gears kind of around the reverse lever. You might have to move it back and forth just a little bit, the 5th and reverse actuator, just to be able to get everything seated in and around. But if you come, it's going to be like an angle like this. The tip of the front, like the 3rd gear and going into the 4th gear parts that are on the tip of the shaft, will just kind of come in angled like this, and you should be able to walk them underneath this arm and get everything laid into place. And then along with that, you will also need the bearing race for the back bearing, which is the one that is here between 5th and 1st. So that will hold it in place in its hole on this side. So I'm gonna go ahead, get it angled into place, and I'll come back once that's done. All right, and here it is, main shaft / output shaft reinstalled, and I did again put the race inside the hole here just to kind of keep it in line. One thing I do want to note is if you look, you'll see the gears aren't going to mash up perfectly because this race does not go flush into this housing. It actually sticks out. I think it's roughly 3/8 of an inch, maybe a quarter out of this wall, because it actually sits recessed into the tail shaft housing. So that'll all come into play later when we set the preload / the preload on the input shaft via shims when that gets installed. That being said, I'm going to do that in a second video. I'm going to make this a two-parter because this one's gone on long enough. So yeah, next video is going to revolve around getting the top cover and the tail housing cleaned up, ready for installation. Get the new fourth gear / input shaft prep for installation, and then it'll be a walkthrough of doing the shimming and setting the proper load / backspacing on the main shaft, so there's no movement or whatnot, and everything's good and tight. And once that's done, everything will be in alignment, and I'll walk you through kind of showing how to do that. I'll probably put the tail housing on, but not the top cover, just so you can kind of see where everything sits once all is said and done, and then I'll do the final assembly. But anyway, if you want to follow along and see how that goes, please hit like, please hit subscribe, please hit the notification bell. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section below. I do review them and I will reply. I do have a second YouTube channel dedicated to firearms. If that's something that interests you, check it out. There is a link in the description to this video. I also have a matching Rumble channel. If you're on Rumble, want to check out my channel, there is a link in the description as well. You may see under this video some merchandise. I do have a merch store selling some shirts and stuff. If you're interested in checking it out, there is a link as well in the description. That being said, thank you very much for watching and have a great day.